Tucson, Ohio. So, welcome to part 3 of Life in Vana'diel, the Final Fantasy XI game guide. We previously discussed different locations and the first 6 starting jobs. Today, we're going to be going into what were known as the advanced jobs in the game. So, if you guys like this content, please let me know in the comments. Please be sure to subscribe, if you'd like to see more content like this. And let's go ahead and get started. So first, we start with Paladin. Paladin was a tank in the game. Again, some great artwork here. Paladin artifact gear, their armor was really distinct in the game. They really stood out. It had this sort of silver on white look to it, and I never played a Paladin, but I saw them often wearing many of these pieces, so these were often useful tanking pieces. Paladin had good artifact gear. Some of their abilities, their 2-hour ability, Invincibility was the name. Basically, for 30 seconds, a Paladin could not be damaged. And I believe this only protected from physical damage. I do not believe Invincible protected from magic damage. But this was, again, a very useful 2-hour ability. If you remember my previous video, I mentioned 2-hour abilities were generally kept in reserve for if things went bad or something went south in a group. You had your 2-hour ability, very powerful, long cooldown, and if something went wrong, you could pop those abilities. Paladin obviously becoming invincible to physical damage for, I believe, 30 seconds. Very useful. Holy Circle offered, I believe, 15 seconds resistance against undead. So if you're fighting skeletons or ghosts, they pop this ability and the entire party receives some bonuses against undead. Cover, this was very useful. Cover would, Paladins could, if they got in between another player who had the enemy's aggro, as long as they were between the player, they would receive damage. So very good for a tank. Shield Bash, this was a stun ability, and it had a pretty high success rate. It was pretty effective, so again, very useful on a tank. Flash was it was actually a spell, but it had lots of enmity, so it helped a tank keep hate on the mob. When we mentioned earlier, or in the previous video, about sub-jobs and warrior being a popular sub-job, almost always a paladin, if they were in a group, their sub was warrior. This gave them access to provoke, the high hit points in defense. Paladins were great tanks. I always liked having a paladin in my party. My main was a red mage, and part of red mage was casting refresh to keep MP. Refresh was kind of like regen for MP. It kept MP rising in each player, and paladins were, I believe, after damage dealers on the list, on the refresh list. It went healers, casters, and then paladin. But they could also cast white magic. They had cure spells. They weren't very high. I think they would start with cure 2, eventually get cure 3, but useful as a tank for keeping their own HP, topped off, or, just a little bit, but also help them maintain some, again, aggro over the monster, maintain hate or enmity. Yeah, paladins, great artwork here, really interesting armor, some very useful abilities. Next we come to Dark Knight. Dark Knight was a damage dealer in the game. You can see here they've got, again, great artwork. You've got a Galka, big giant Galka with their tail, with a scythe. Scythe was, it was a good weapon for them, but mostly, if you see here, this character Zaid, he's got a great sword. I often saw Dark Knights using great swords over a scythe. Now, if you remember your Final Fantasy, I believe 2 from Super Nintendo, Super Famicom, Dark Knight was Cecil. Remember, he starts out as a Dark Knight, and then eventually he becomes a Paladin. But yes, this was the damage dealer class for this game. Well, there was other damage dealer classes, but a very popular one. Some of their abilities, okay, blood weapon. This was their 2-hour ability, and this allowed them to, with each successful hit, they absorbed HP from an enemy. So again, very useful if things are going south. They could pop this, and while they're doing damage, they self-heal. Arcane Circle, another protection ability for the party against arcane-type monsters. If you look here, this ugly little fellow down here is called a Weapon. That was their name, Weapon. That's an arcane-type monster. Weapon Bash, very similar to a Paladin's Shield Bash. It was a stun move, and it was actually just as effective, I believe, as Shield Bash. So you had an additional stun in your party with a Dark Knight. And now, stun was important in Final Fantasy when, as I mentioned in the last video, you had weapon skills. You filled a meter similar to a limit break in other Final Fantasy games, and then you had access to stronger weapon skills. Now, the thing was, enemies also had access to that. When an enemy filled up their TP meter, they could drop a big attack on the party. Stun would basically negate that. As long as you got it off in time, then you could basically stun an enemy's TP move. So those were very useful on Dark Knight. But something we need to come to here is Soul Eater. Soul Eater. This was a really powerful ability. What this did was it added damage to every successful hit, and the damage was based on 10% of the Dark Knight's HP. But now it also the Dark Knight would use their own HP for that damage, if that makes sense. So it was useful, but they would lose HP doing it. So when they used Soul Eater, a healer had to watch out and drop cures on them. Now, one thing that was common when someone used Blood Weapon, if they had Soul Eater up, they would use that, and you basically got all the extra damage from Soul Eater, but you recovered HP because you were using Blood Weapon. Now, there was a very interesting sort of tactic that arose with Soul Eater and Dark Knight. In the game, there was a weapon called a Kraken Club. It was a one-handed little wooden club. It didn't have a lot of damage to it, but what it did do is it would strike 1 to 8 times on a successful hit. This basically meant if you had a Kraken Club, you never stopped swinging. Delay did not matter. And what this meant was a Dark Knight using one of these could put out a lot of damage. Now, these clubs were one of the most expensive items in the game. They were extremely rare to drop. Even now, in 2023, in the game, a Kraken Club is still, it's in the tens of millions of gil. There was a boss during these times when the level cap was 75. It was one of the highest bosses in the game. It was Kieran. It was in what was called Sky, and a strategy arose to fight Kieran where a Dark Knight would have a Kraken club in basically in each hand. They would dual wield them, and what they would do is they would use Soul Eater, and that 10% of their hit points was added to each hit. So remember, they never stop swinging with those Kraken clubs. It's 1 to 8 hits. So literally each time they swing, it can be 1, it can be 2, it can be 3, it can be 4, and they literally never stop swinging. And if the Dark Knight's hit points are 1,000, that means they're putting out 100 damage on top of their regular damage with each hit. It was I was never in a group with the strategy. It was so expensive to have those clubs. But groups who did it, they could kill one of the most difficult enemies in the game very quickly. Now, it was not without its risk. Basically, every healer was just spamming cures on the Dark Knight. Bards would put their haste and their attack spells on it. Basically, it was just putting out massive amounts of damage while eating up its own HP, and the rest of the party was literally just dropping everything they could on the Dark Knight to keep it alive. It was a really just interesting little, again, not an exploit. It was not an exploit. It was a strategy. It was extremely expensive and difficult because no one could get a Kraken club. But there were LSs, and LS is like would be like basically a guild, a group. There were LSs, link shells, that were able to do that, and Soul Eater was a huge part of that. So you had Dark Knight, dual Kraken clubs, Soul Eater. I think you needed 2 Dark Knights, and you could kill Keating, again, one of the strongest enemies of the game at that point. I think it took like 5 minutes. It was really out there. But yeah, Dark Knight. Again, some great artwork here. That scythe, you gotta love that, right? This massive scythe. Yeah, so that's Dark Knight. And now Beastmaster. Again, I love this artwork. Look at that. You've got this Taru leaping through the air mid-swing with his axe, or her axe, I can't really tell. And you've gotta love their artifact gear. It's basically like a sheep helm, a whole bunch of sheep's wool. Beastmaster was this time, the only class in the game actually designed for soloing. Final Fantasy was not a game designed around single play, I should say. The game was designed for parties, and somewhat strict party structure, tank, healer, damage dealers, which is not exactly unusual. But they actually designed Beastmaster for players who just wanted to play on their own, and Beastmasters charmed other beasts and used those to fight beasts. Now, the XP they gained by fighting alone, it was not superior to being in a party, but you could basically play whenever you wanted this way. Rather, instead of having to build a party or wait for a party, a Beastmaster could just go to whichever area was appropriate for their level, charm monsters, and they basically just could gain XP on their own. It was an interesting class, and it was nice that Square Enix added this class to the game for people who just wanted to do their own thing. Now, there were, let's see if I can find it. This was towards the back. Let me see, there was a way for Beastmasters to, where is it? It's close. Here we go. There were more efficient ways for Beastmasters to level, because there was sort of different monsters had weaknesses to other monsters. For example, birds were stronger than aquans, crabs, and fish, whereas crabs and fish were stronger to amorphs. These were like leeches. Same with lizards, were stronger than vermin, like caterpillars. So what often Beastmasters would do, they would look for areas that had some of these monsters together. So if there was an area with birds, they could use those to fight crabs. And then when they charmed the bird, they would get a bonus. The bird was just better equipped to fight crabs than a crab against a bird. And a big one was plantoids. Now, they've got a Malboro here. That's a pretty popular monster from Final Fantasy lore. But often there were these things called fungars. They were basically walking mushrooms. And often they would charm those and use them against beasts and so on. I'm not sure why they have undead and arcana. I don't believe you could ever charm an undead. Maybe you could charm arcana and use those against undead. And dragons and demons, I don't believe you could ever charm a dragon. But this was sort of the chart. I think they called it the beast wheel. I can't remember. There was a name to it that beast masters would use, or a lot of times it was called beasts. Beast masters would use when they would go and level on their own. So, and there were guides for beast masters of the best places to go, which levels to go there, and which monsters were available for them to use. Really not familiar with any of their abilities. I believe familiar, their 2-hour ability. I'm really not sure. I think that let them call. No, I think that just gave their monster some extra strength. I'm not sure, because Call Beast was different than Tame. Tame, you actually had to charm an enemy to fight for you. Call Beast was you had what were called jug pets. You had items that you could use, and you called, for example, cargo crab Colin. It was a cargo crab. You could actually call different enemies that way. Charm, that's the animation right there. Charm was basically, that's how you could charm. You turned an enemy to fight for you. So yeah, I really don't know much about Beastmaster, but again, gotta love that artwork. That's gorgeous. I love it. I love the sort of watercolor aspect to it, the kind of sketch, sort of like the pencils and inks to it. Just wow, great stuff. Yep. So that is Beastmaster. Next we come to Bard. Bards were absolutely sought after in Final Fantasy for just about everything, whether an XP party, if you were doing some of the higher level bosses. Bards were just absolutely useful. They were the class, like a support class. They buffed the party with various songs, which I think most people are familiar with a bard class in any game. But some of the most useful were for damage dealers. They gave haste or accuracy. The haste they gave to damage dealers was extremely useful. For casters, they would also give MP buffs, like I mentioned. As red mage, my main job was to refresh the other mages so that just less downtime, they didn't have to rest their MP. A bard also had this ability with their songs. I believe, the haste song was called March, Advancing March, and I believe MP songs were called Ballad, Mage's Ballad, I believe. And the thing was, they were positional. You had a certain range for each song. So when you had a bard in your party, you would need to position different people in different places. And most people kind of knew this. So when we had a bard, we would get the best positions we needed to. For example, the tank and the damage dealers would be on one side. They would get either haste or accuracy buffs, or even attack buffs. Sometimes it depended on what people needed. And then the mages would be down here, so the bard would run back, cast the mage buff songs down here, and then I think they would put damage debuff songs on the mob, the enemy also. But extremely useful. In fact, one of my favorite party combinations was not even having a white mage, not not having a white mage in the party, but myself, a red mage, and a bard. If you had a good enough party, you could have extremely fast fights. I would be refreshing the casters, the bard would be refreshing the casters, so there was never any issue with MP. And then the bard is also putting attack buffs onto the damage dealers in the tank, and now that meant healing fell upon both of us, but bards usually subbed white mage, and a red mage could also sub white mage, so we had access to some heals. And if you had a good enough party playing well enough, it was really one of my favorite combinations. A bard and a red mage, then you had your 3 damage dealers and your tank. It was awesome. Bards were really useful. Soul Voice, the bard's 2-hour ability. What Soul Voice did, it doubled the effects of their songs, and this was something that was easily seen. If you had the haste song on, you march, and they did Soul Voice, you could see what a double haste looked like, or a haste with twice the power looked like. You would just not stop swinging your weapon. And when I talked about the positional parts earlier with the party, you could only have 2 beneficial songs on you from one bard. So if you had one bard in your party, usually you had like 2 hastes or 2 attack spells, like the attack spell 1, attack spell 2, or I guess March, it'd be Advancing March 1, Advancing March 2, I believe. I may be wrong about that, but I do know you could only have 2 songs on you at once. That's why they would put the 2 MP boost or refresh songs on the mages, and then the 2 attack songs on the damage dealers, because if they got too close, you'd have attack buff songs on your mages, and that didn't do much good. But Soul Voice would double that. And I remember in one battle, actually, it was a famous fight against an enemy called Hakutaku. It was an enemy covered with eyes, and you got a hat from him, the optical hat. But I was on my Dragoon, and Dragoon uses a lance, which is a very long delay, a slow weapon. The bard cast Soul Voice and put March on me, and I actually pulled hate from the tank. I was swinging so consistently on this mob, Dragoons put out pretty good damage with their lance, and I actually pulled hate off of a Paladin. So this Soul Voice was an excellent 2-hour ability. Yeah, bards were absolutely sought after. They never had to look for a party. If they needed an experience point party, they put their flag up and they'd get an infight, within minutes. And that was when people weren't just bugging them out of the blue, basically cold calling them, sending them tells in game. Hey, do you want to join our party? Can you come help us? And they never really needed to, because they always found parties. But bards were excellent. I always felt like I should have leveled a bard, just because it would have been so easy to get by, but I had already committed to red mage. But yeah, bards were great, and they had wind and string instruments. They had here you see them with a harp, a lute, I'm not sure what that is, and they also had wind instruments as well. I think these were their main weapons, and these were in their range slot. I could be wrong. Maybe both of these are in their actually, yeah, both of these were in their ranged slot. Oh yeah, by the way, you can see the animation here. When the bard did Soul Voice, a little disco ball popped out of the sky and made a bunch of glowing animation. If you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons online, when you do Otto's dancing sphere, and a little disco ball comes out and you can dance the mobs, similar on here. They do their ability, a disco ball popped out of the sky, and that's how Soul Voice was animated. Yeah, bards, absolutely great class in the game. And now on to Ranger. Again, I love this artwork. Mithra, she's got that bow that's just about as tall as she is. She's kind of got the arrow knocked. She's sort of like leaning over. She draws on the string. Great artwork. Very fun artifact armor. Their cap, to this day I have no idea what Square Enix was thinking by putting what looks almost like a pot leaf, a marijuana leaf, on their beret. I think it's supposed to be a flower, a leaf, or not a flower, like a feather. I have no idea, but there was a bright green leaf that looked quite similar to something else. But yeah, great artwork here. Rangers were outstanding damage dealers in the game. If you had a ranger in your party, you were putting out a lot of damage. They were always great to have in a party. Eagle Eye Shot, their 2-hour ability, basically just a massive attack. They could put out a large amount of damage in one hit, and apparently, I didn't know this, it did not actually generate a lot of enmity. So basically, they could, unleash pretty decent amount of damage on a mob, and it would not turn the mob's attention toward them. So that was Eagle Eye Shot. Scavenge was weird. Scavenge was you could every now and then check the ground and you'd find arrows or something, but it wasn't really very useful. I don't recall. Barrage was an attack that I think it was 3 attacks, and then as you leveled, got higher levels, it became 5 attacks, and then 7, basically in one. So rather than have the delay of one attack, you shot like 5 arrows at the enemy. So Barrage was very powerful. Shadowbind was interesting. This was bind. It bound a monster. It stuck them in place, but only as long as you didn't attack them. So if you ever found yourself in trouble, you could Shadowbind a monster, run away, and for about 20 seconds the monster was just stuck there, as long as you did not attack it. So it gave you a little bit of time to maybe heal up, sort of regroup. But yeah, useful ability. Another one not listed here is Wide Scan. Wide Scan. Rangers had an ability from level 1, I believe level 1, where when you opened the in-game map, you could see every enemy around you for, not for the entire map, but you could actually scroll through a log and see different enemies, which was extremely useful when you were hunting notorious monsters, NMs, notorious monsters. I believe I mentioned those in one of the earlier videos. There were special monsters running around, or special enemies running around different parts of the game, and they often dropped really good gear. Sometimes they dropped amazing gear, other times they dropped junk. I apologize, there's an announcement outside. We had a typhoon a tropical storm pass through today, and they're giving the all clear outside, so I apologize if you hear a muffled voice on the loudspeakers in my neighborhood. But so Ranger got Wide Scan, and so if you were hunting a notorious monster, you could pop your map, and while other people were running around just trying to visually sight the monster, if it was up, if it had spawned, a ranger could see it on their mini-map. And not only that, you could select it, and then it would show up on the in-game compass map, and you could run right towards it. It was an extremely useful ability that a lot of people, if they were ever hunting notorious monsters, even if their ranger was low level, they'd sometimes... sorry, again, that sound outside. They would put Ranger as a sub-job just to have that Wide Scan ability. So yeah, Wide Scan was extremely useful. Ranger was a great job until they nerfed it. I remember when I was playing, Rangers were they were kind of unbeatable for damage. Now, it was an expensive job. Arrows were consumables in the game. They had to be crafted, and Rangers had to buy them themselves. And so it was an expensive job to maintain, so that all that damage output came at a cost. And then one day the devs nerfed it. They tried to do something where they said apparently in archery, there's this, I guess it's physics, but your arrow gains a little more piercing power or strength, not strength, piercing power or power, being shot further away. Like, yeah, I guess if you shoot something, right in front of you, like 2 feet, the arrow's going to hit it, but not as strong as if it was, I guess, 20 feet away, because the arrow actually gets momentum or something. They changed that in the game. Basically, before that change, the Rangers would just stand right around with the damage dealers, shooting point blank and putting out awesome damage. When they made this change, their damage was nerfed unless they were at a certain distance away. And it took people like weeks to figure out the optimal distance. The problem was, a lot of times in Final Fantasy, where you were camped fighting monsters, you had to be kind of tucked away close because there were dangerous monsters all around. And you'd find a safe spot, but you couldn't just be running around everywhere, or you'd link other monsters. So I don't know why they made this change. The explanation was, it needs to be more realistic and in line with how true life archery works. But come on, it's a game. It's a cat person. I mean, do we really need, archery physics in the game? But they did that, and I don't know if it ever went back, but I remember when Rangers they were still around, but not like they once were. There was a time when everyone played Ranger because there was just so much damage they could put out. And, of course, the devs, in their infinite wisdom, decided to, get the Nerf bat and, take away the fun, I guess. But yeah, Rangers, great class. Again, I love that artwork. That's so great. Really quick, too, they used bows and crossbows, but they actually released guns for Rangers after a while. Guns had a lot of damage, very long delay. So sometimes Rangers would use guns. Again, the bullets were extremely expensive to make. Well, not extremely, but, if you're in a party for 2 or 3 hours, you're shooting every 2 or 3 seconds. That could be, 200 bullets you go through. Well, more than that, probably like 300. And the costs add up, but they actually added guns to the game for Rangers. Eventually there was another class that used guns, but yeah, so yeah, that is Ranger. And on to Samurai, Sam. Again, some pretty cool artwork here with that great katana. There were 2 types of katana in the game. You had the smaller ones, and then the great katana, they called it GKT. It was a dual-handed weapon. This was interesting. It's always been theorized that Samurai was supposed to be a second tank, sort of in addition to Warrior or Paladin, because the Samurai artifact gear actually had a few pieces with enmity on it. It actually had hate. So it was theorized that this was originally designed as a tank, as another tank, which kind of makes sense, in Japanese culture. They kind of look at samurai as being like, kind of like knights and so on. But that's not what ended up happening with it. It instead became a damage dealer. Samurai had a lot of moves to gain TP more quickly. Now, TP is not what it might sound like. It stood for tactical points, I believe. And as I mentioned earlier with the game, every class, but mostly damage dealers, had a limit gauge they filled. It wasn't called a limit gauge, but that's essentially what it was. Just like all the other Final Fantasies, when you filled up that meter, you had a more powerful attack. Samurai had several skills where they could do that more quickly, which meant they had the means to put out weapon skills or to perform weapon skills more quickly than other players. What essentially happened with this is, even though, again, it's theorized they were designed as a tank, they were far better utilized as damage dealers. Their 2-hour ability, Make Yoshisui, it instantly gave them, I believe, 3,000 TP. That was the max you could have in the game, was 3,000. Um, but it also meant you could do 3 weapon skills, because it would max out your TP meter, but I believe each one only cost 1,000. What usually happened was, if you filled your meter to 3,000, you just did a stronger weapon skill. But for them, it allowed them to do like 3 weapon skills. And then meditate, that gave them TP kind of instantly. So it became a damage dealer in the game. Third Eye was just, they would dodge the next attack. Warding Circle protected against demons. This gave the entire party I believe a 15 or 30 second resist, a buff against demons. But yeah, Samurai was really supposed to be a tank. From what I've read, their armor was sort of designed for tanking, but they just were so much better suited as damage dealers. That's where they kind of evolved into. I never leveled a samurai, but again, they were great to have in a party because they put out so much damage. And plus, their sword had the best sound effects too. You had that, like, I'm not going to try to emulate it, but if you've ever seen an anime with a samurai sword, that distinct sort of sound that you always hear, you'd hear that in the party. So as you're fighting, you just hear that samurai sword, a katana sort of sound. It was always a bit fun. And yeah, again, great artwork here. Got the old traditional samurai kabuto, the helmet, the armor. Yeah, very cool looking. Okay, now we come to Ninja. Ninja was fascinating in the game because, quite opposite of Samurai, Ninja was clearly designed to be a sort of damage dealer, and the opposite happened. Ninja ended up becoming a tank, which doesn't seem it doesn't seem like what you would think of a ninja. They're assassins, they're, kind of in the shadows and so on. And that's really what they were designed to be. They had throwing weapons. They had shuriken, ninja stars and things they were supposed to throw at the enemy. They were sort of, they were consumables, the way a ranger would be shooting from the sidelines. A ninja was going to be doing that. They had ninja magic, ninjutsu. They could cast spells on an enemy that they weren't exactly heavy damage, but there was what was called the elemental wheel. They would roll through this, and each spell would weaken the enemy to the next one. For example, they'd cast an earth spell, I think, and then that would weaken the enemy to an ice spell. So then they'd cast their ice spell, and then that would weaken the enemy to wind, and so on. They would go through that elemental wheel. That was the intention. What ended up happening is they became a tank because of this spell right here, Utsusemi. This created shadows. Basically, when the ninja cast this, they had 3 shadows that absorbed any attack, a magic attack or a physical attack. And what people quickly learned was that if you geared a ninja correctly, and you learned how to use this spell with the right timing, a ninja would never get hit. They never needed to be healed. They would just keep their shadows up, keep the enemy, or keep the monster on them, and they never took a hit. And what was fascinating about this, you would think that that kind of gameplay would instantly be nerfed. That the devs would say, no, we never intended a ninja to be a tank. We're going to, change that. We're going to make the casting of the spell longer, make the cooldown longer. They never did. I was so shocked that, especially in a Japanese game company, that they were open-minded enough, like relaxed enough to say, oh, they're playing a ninja as a tank? Sure, why not? And they just let it go. So, a few quick things to describe how that works. Okay, so Utsusemi, there was Utsusemi Ichi, Utsusemi Ni, Utsusemi 1 and 2. You received the first Utsusemi at, I believe, level 15? 15, I'm not sure. That gave you 3 shadows. At level 37, you got Utsusemi Ni. That gave you 3 additional shadows. Now, they didn't quite stack. There was a timing to it. You could not overwrite Utsusemi 2 with Utsusemi 1, the shadows from that. So what you did was, you kept Utsusemi 1 shadows on you, and then you had to keep an eye on how many the monster had hit you, how many they'd taken away, and when your last shadow was up, you cast Utsusemi Ni. And then if you timed it right, the monster would kill your 3rd shadow while you were casting the 2nd spell. Boom, you've got 3 shadows over you. Where it was tricky was when you went from 2 to 1, because you had to wait for the spells to cool down. So you've got Utsusemi Ni up on you, or up on the caster, the ninja. And then if you didn't time it right and you cast Utsusemi Ichi 1, it would not overwrite that shadow for 2. And what would happen was you'd still be on the minute cooldown for the spell and only 1 shadow. It probably sounds extremely complicated. It really wasn't. Well, the timing was. I had a ninja, and it took me a while to learn, but I was able to do it. But I was nowhere near as good as some of the really good players. But basically, if you timed these 2 spells right, a ninja never got hit. They didn't need any healing. You could really get by with not even having a healer. And if you remember, I mentioned a little bit earlier about one of the best combos that I ever was in was with a bard and a red mage and a bard, and no healer. We had a ninja tank. So when there was some healing required, we could cover it, but the ninja, for their part, just kept those shadows up. So this was always so fascinating to me that, I mean, in 9 games out of 10, if a job had started being played this way, a damage dealing job had somehow morphed into a tank, 9 games out of 10, I imagine there would have been some change by the devs. They would not have let that stand, and for some strange reason, a 20-year-old Japanese game, they let Ninja be a tank, and it did. So it was very interesting. Another thing Ninja was extremely useful was as a sub-job. Dual wield. Dual wield was amazing for so many other jobs. And not only that, Utsusemi. A lot of jobs would sub Ninja because they'd have shadows of their own. Now, they just had Utsusemi Ichi, so they only had 3 shadows, but that's pretty good protection. And then dual wield, where this became really useful, jobs like Ranger. A Ranger would sub Ninja because they could hold 2 different daggers. And basically, if you had 1 dagger with high accuracy, well, 2 is better. You get even more accuracy. You got the stats and the buffs from the dual wield on that. Another class that often subbed Ninja was Thief. Now, this is the original Thief they're showing with the shield, which when Thief was first released, there was no Ninja, but after Ninja was released, Thieves almost always were subbing Ninja. Again, same thing, they had those 2 daggers. They could hold 2 daggers, they got extra buffs, and they got some shadows as well. Now, there was a pretty complicated in-game calculation for the weapon delay, because basically if you have 2 daggers, are you swinging twice as fast? Are you getting 2 attacks per turn? So there was a bit of a delay with that, so it helped to have haste cast on anyone who had dual wield, but Ninja became extremely popular for that. So yeah, there's Ninja. Oh, and Mijin Gakure. Ninja's 2-hour ability, they blew up. I'm not joking. A ninja would explode and die, causing between 50 to 80% damage to a monster. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that Final Fantasy had severe XP penalties upon death. This 2-hour ability did not affect that. So if you were in trouble and the whole party was going to wipe, well, the ninja could blow up, maybe kill the monster, and if not, well, they didn't lose any XP. In fact, a lot of times it was called a blood warp, I think it was called. A ninja, when a party was over, if you didn't have a way to warp, the ninja would just say bye, blow themselves up, and they'd get to their home point that way. So yeah, ninja was a lot of fun. Yeah, never meant to be a tank, but that's what it became. Again, you got some fun armor here. You got a Mithra in the ninja armor, dual wielding those two. Was it Kunitachi? I think, I'm not sure. I always forget what those are called, but yeah, that was ninja. And on to Dragoon. Dragoon was my absolute favorite. Now, you may remember I said that Red Mage, was that Red Mage? Here we go. Red Mage was my main. This was on PlayStation 2. Now, I left the game for a while, just because playing on PlayStation 2 was difficult. And I started playing, I think, Warcraft for a while, but then I went back to Final Fantasy on my PC and decided to level a Dragoon. Dragoon was so much fun. Now, again, first you've got this just gorgeous artwork here. I love it. Dragoon armor, very iconic. This was Kain from not Dragon Warrior, from Final Fantasy 2. That very distinct armor. Dragoon was a fun class, not a popular one for several reasons. It was just thought of as not being optimal in a party as far as damage went. People preferred a samurai or a ranger before rangers got nerfed. But I chose to level 1 anyway. Now, playing Dragoon was like playing on hard mode. It wasn't a hard class to play. It was actually an easy class. It was just a damage dealer. But nobody wanted to invite Dragoons, so I had to get very good at making my own parties. Searching for, first a tank, then a healer, and then damage dealers, then finding a camp. I took my Dragoon to level 75 when that was the cap, and it was a lot of work. I had to make my own parties. So in this game, Dragoon has a wyvern. Dragoon's 2-hour ability is much different from others. You basically have a pet that's with you always unless it dies, and it does damage. Now, the damage wasn't amazing or spectacular, but it's constant. It was like a constant sort of not DPS. What's the word I'm looking at? Damage over time. It was like a dot. It was just always hitting the enemy, and then when you did a weapon skill, it would spit fire. It would do a breath attack, is what it was called. So, over the long term, like if you were in a party for 2 or 3 hours, a Dragoon's 2-hour ability was basically the strongest in the game, but it was because it was spaced out. It wasn't quite, it wasn't really looked that way. But Dragoons were, I thought they were good in parties, and if you geared them right, they could do some good damage. Their abilities: jump. Everyone knows jump. You jump in the air and you land on the monster. Ancient circle. That's similar to what we saw with the Dark Knight and the Paladin and the Samurai, except Ancient Circle offered protection against dragons. And Spirit Link, you could not heal your wyvern. If your wyvern took damage, the healer could not cast on it. The only thing you could do was you would have to sacrifice some of your own HP to the wyvern, and then you would get healed up. Now, this is a bit older. After this, they added an ability. I can't remember what it was. Spirit Surge. You could basically eat your wyvern. You didn't eat it. You absorbed its power, but it was, I believe it was an hour cooldown. I can't quite remember, because what they realized was that Call Wyvern, it didn't give a Dragoon any sort of emergency ability, which really was what 2 hours were about. They were kind of like an emergency ability, or just something to use when everything else went wrong. And Dragoon did not have that, so they gave them Spirit Surge. And when you ate your wyvern or absorbed it, you got an attack bonus, a haste bonus for I believe 30 seconds, and it was significant. It was not bad. So it was something, if things went wrong, you could eat your wyvern, and if your 2 hour was back up, you could call your wyvern again. And those are some of the abilities. Another one not listed here, you had super jump. Super jump was funny. If you did a super jump, you would actually, I think it moved you a bit further back from the fight, and you basically lost all aggro. So if things were going really bad, the Dragoon could super jump, and I think they'd still survive. Like, you could actually jump away from the enemy and not be killed. I believe. I could be mistaken about that. This was another class that was actually in the very beginning of this expansion was extremely popular, and then also got nerfed. Dragoon had an ability called Pentathrust. It's actually a weapon skill. Penta meaning 5. This weapon skill hit 5 times. But when it was first designed, when you performed the weapon skill, every hit with it gave you some TP back. So you would get 100 TP, or 100% TP. I think it was actually 1,000. It was, Final Fantasy was bizarre. To do a weapon skill, you needed 100% TP, but it was actually 1,000 TP. I don't know. I don't know why. But so when you did this weapon skill, and then you would do pentathrust, five thrusts, and each one of those thrusts gave you some TP back. So I believe after one weapon skill, you were almost halfway to another weapon skill, which meant the Dragoons were great damage dealers. And what happened for a while was Dragoons would sub Samurai for Meditate, for some of the other abilities, and they were just non-stop doing Penta spams, what they called it. And there was a time when everyone loved Dragoons. That did not last. The devs saw that, and to be fair, it was pretty imbalanced. People were playing Dragoon, and there was no real strategy. You just subbed Samurai, and you did nothing but just spam Pentathrust. So that got nerfed pretty quickly. In the description, I'll link the history of Final Fantasy 11, and they'll mention when this nerf happens. So I'll point to that in the description. But yeah, after that, the sort of reputation of Dragoon never recovered, and people just really, they didn't like them in a party. It was difficult to get a party if you were a Dragoon. It was always kind of a bummer, but, well, not to me. I took mine to 75. I loved my Dragoon. It was such a fun class. So yep, that was Dragoon. And finally, last but certainly not least of the advanced jobs during Rise of Zalart era, Summoner. Summoner, again, just absolutely beautiful artwork here. You've got Carbuncle. I don't remember if Carbuncle was quite popular in other games. I first saw Carbuncle in Final Fantasy 3? Final Fantasy 3, when you get the different summons in that game, and I remember seeing Carbuncle. But a major part of Summoner in this game, it was the quest, basically, to unlock this job. And again, you've got this Taru Summoner here. That was something, actually, I forgot to mention. All of the advanced jobs... Now these jobs here, the basic jobs, these were all open right from the start of the game. These advanced jobs here, you had to do a quest. You had to actually unlock each of these jobs. And some of them were easier than others, some were difficult. I remember for Dragoon, you had to go and you had to get a pickaxe and do mining and find a wyvern egg. Summoner had one of the most amazing quests in the game. I loved it, and it started with Carbuncle. But we're going to get to that in a second. First, just a quick kind of description. Summoner summons... Let me see if they're back here. Find them all. Basically the classic summons from Final Fantasy. Shiva, Ramu, Titan, Leviathan. Ifrit, and Garuda. There became some others available within the game as it expanded. Fenrir was available, but you start with Carbuncle, and then depending on what was needed in the party, depending on the type of monster you were fighting, you might use Ifrit, you might use Shiva, you might use Garuda, and so on. So Summoner was a damage dealer. They were a spellcaster. You start with Carbuncle. You also got spirits. There was elementals in the game that you could use. These were not very common. Most players relied on the actual summons. Astral Flow. Astral Flow was the summoner's 2-hour ability. This spell, it basically, each summon had sort of like, not an ultimate attack, but a final attack that could only be done under Astral Flow. And when a summoner used this, the whichever avatar or summon was out would do a major attack with it. And I think it drained all of the summoner's HP. HP, MP. It was like just one massive attack that the summoner could do. But Astral Flow was interesting. And really quickly, I remember earlier I showed you on a previous video where here they've got different weapons listed. They've actually got an Astral Signa listed here, which this was one of the most difficult weapons to get in the game. I actually made a mistake 2 videos ago when I mentioned this sword here, a riddle. I said this was from an orc, HNM. It was wrong. It was actually Fafnir. Fafnir dropped this. But this was from an HNM, not an NM, an HNM, a hyper notorious monster. This was from what are they called? A Yagudo. These were like the bird people, and actually I think they might show him here in, let me see, Kadav's goblins. Yep, right here. That's him. What's his name? Jushu's Magnificent? Is that his name? CG. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I can read katakana, but it's such a weird. Shijiku the Manifest. Yeah, manifest. That's easy enough. Shijiku or Shiju. Okay, I guess the C is silent. Shiju the Manifest. This monster only spawned every, I think, 36 to 48 hours. Not real time. That's not game time. So 3 to 4 times or twice a week, basically. And it took a large amount of people to beat him, and then that's even if you got the drop. So it's so funny they show this weapon. This was a very difficult weapon to get for summoners, but if a summoner got this, it was very useful. When you had your avatar out, they drained your MP, but this actually reduced that a bit, so it just was extremely useful because the summoner could keep their summon out, do more damage. Okay, so that's a little bit about that. What I want to talk about is the quest for Summoner. So to unlock Summoner, you had to get a Carbuncle Ruby. You would get those from leech enemies all over the game. There was the one area in particular where they dropped most. And then you needed to take the Ruby to different zones in the game with different weather. There was actually weather in the game. There was, wind weather. There was actually, I can show you. I believe it's right here. The elemental section. Excuse me. No, it's back this way. Here we go. Okay. So these are the different elements in the game, and you actually had different weather in the game associated with this. Fire was heat waves, water was rain, ice was blizzards, wind, gales, light, auroras, darkness was just dark weather. It was weird. Thunder, thunderstorms, and then earth, dust storms. Now, some of this weather was very easy. You could find rain in many areas in the game. So you entered that zone with a Carbuncle Ruby in your possession. All it had to be was in your inventory. You had to unlock the quest. You had the quest unlocked, and you did that. Once you entered a zone with rain, your Carbuncle Ruby would give you a little cutscene. You would actually get a cutscene in the zone. When you went to a zone with a thunderstorm, you would get a cutscene for that. You had to do each one of these. I don't think you needed light and darkness. In fact, no, you did not. You just needed these elements here. Most of these were pretty easy to get. Ice could be tricky, but not too bad. Fire was the difficult one. Heat waves, those were rare and only in a few areas. But once you did that, once you got each of those in the Carbuncle Ruby, you went to a certain area. It was actually right off of my starting area. It was called Lathen Plateau. And you finished the quest there. And when it was done, Carbuncle would come, say, hey, I'm yours. Okay, and then boom, you unlocked Summoner. You had access to Carbuncle. But what was so cool was in the zone, a rainbow would appear. A giant rainbow, and everyone could see it. So occasionally you'd be going through Lathen, and you'd see just a big giant rainbow in the background, and you'd know, hey, a summoner somewhere, got their Carbuncle, they got their Carby. It was such a fun little thing. Like I imagine when the devs were creating this quest that they just, maybe they had fun with it and thought, oh, let's do something that everyone can see. So I will put a link in the description to some information about that Carbuncle quest, hopefully a video showing it. It was such a neat little thing. You could actually see in game when another player had finished this quest and unlocked their Carbuncle. So that is Summoner, and that is all for the advanced jobs. Alright, so that is all for that. If you guys enjoyed this, please subscribe and leave me a comment. Did you play any of these jobs in Final Fantasy? Did you have a Summoner, a Dragoon? Were you a ninja tank, samurai, ranger? Did you play Bard, Beastmaster? Did you solo, Dark Knight, or Paladin? Please leave me a comment. Let me know if you enjoyed this. And yeah, thanks everyone. Hope you guys enjoyed. That's life in Vana'diel, Final Fantasy 11. Again, thanks a lot, guys. Please let me know if you enjoyed this. Hope you had fun.